State power affects a lot of subjects this group addresses, from climate change and the linear no threshold model of radiation to saturated fats and DDT. This talk is on what state power did to Shakespeare. The literary world celebrated William Shakespeare on the 400th anniversary of his death. In the US, sponsors had the 1623 First Folio go on tour and be displayed in all 50 states. In the UK, tourists flooded Stratford-upon-Avon attending exhibits and activities the Shakespeare Birthday Trust put on. The only problem is they celebrate the wrong person. This person was born in 1564 and christened William Shakespeare. Little is known about him. One of 8 children, he was the firstborn son of John Shakespeare or Shakespeare. The name was spelled both ways in records. He was a glove maker and a brogger, a dealer in wool. Stratford-upon-Avon was a small country town, a 4-day ride from London, and its citizens spoke a different dialect of English. The town had no public library and few books, and most of Stratford's citizens could not read or write, including Shakespeare's parents, siblings, wife, and children. English was then largely a spoken language. The town had one grammar school, which enrolled 12 to 24 students, accommodating 1/20th to 1/10 of the boys living in Stratford, and to charge tuition. Fathers groomed their firstborn sons to learn and ply their respective trades. And the last thing they would do was pay to send that son to school to learn Latin. The only thing known for sure about Stratford's William Shakespeare in his first 28 years is a marriage license to one woman and then a marriage certificate to a different woman on the next day, followed by the birth of a child 6 months later. Then there were twins that came after that. And that's it in the record. Records show that the Stratford William was first in London in 1592 at age 28. And one document shows that he made a 7-pound loan there. Some 24 business and legal records spanning the next 20 years show him to be a trader in grain, a moneylender, a landowner, a shareholder in 2 public theaters, and possibly a part-time actor. He was a successful businessman, and in 1597 purchased the largest domestic house in Stratford with 30 main rooms. He died in 1616 at age 52, and leaving an estate worth $1.5 million in today's dollars. Nothing exists during this person's lifetime that indicates he was a writer. But front matter on the First Folio, published 7 years later, hints that the Stratford man wrote the plays. In an elegy to Shakespeare, Ben Jonson calls him the sweet swan of Avon. And Leonard Digges, in a poem lamenting his death, refers to thy Stratford monument. There was a Shakespeare monument in Stratford's Holy Trinity Church, but it most likely was one of his father, John, resting his hands on a sack of wool. Years later, officials changed it to show his son William holding a quill pen and with the other hand placed on a cushion and with a piece of paper like it is today. The Stratford William Shakespeare did not become widely known and accepted until the 18th century, when in 1607 Nicholas Rowe appended a short 1,000-word biography to a new edition of Shakespeare plays. Then in 1769, actor David Garrick rekindled interest in the bard and put Stratford-upon-Avon on the map by staging a Shakespeare Jubilee there. It included the firing of cannons, a dinner for 700 people, most of them from England, from London, and a masquerade. Now, 250 years later, Stratford-upon-Avon is one of the top tourist spots in England, attracting 800,000 paying visitors each year and 1 million children, and generating a $12 million profit each year. The first full biography of the Stratford William Shakespeare by Charles Knight appeared in 1843. It unwittingly revealed how little is known about this man. The Stratford William never claimed to have written the Shakespeare plays and poems. Not as a businessman did he ever seek to profit from the publication and performance of them. Doubt soon arose about this person being the author of the Shakespeare Canon. Literary minds at the time began questioning how an unlettered businessman that never seek to, from a provincial market town, could have written these erudite, amazing poems and plays. Doubt soon arose, and Henry James put it bluntly, I am sort of haunted by the conviction that the divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced on a patient world. Mark Twain, in his last book, Is Shakespeare Dead?, with 4 question marks, published a year before he died, writes, an Eiffel Tower of artificialities rise sky high from a very thin foundation of inconsequential facts. He compares the creation of Shakespeare's biography to the reconstruction of a dinosaur with a few bits of bone stuck together with plaster. And William James wrote, a visit to Stratford became the leading contender for the great author until 1920, and that was Francis Bacon. J. Thomas Loney, a school teacher in England who taught Shakespeare, shared these concerns and set out to find the true author. Loney pursued the Shakespeare authorship question like a detective investigating a homicide. He studied an anthology of 16th century poetry, searching for every poet who wrote poems in stanzas like those Shakespeare used in his first published work, Venus and Adonis. Loney found only one person in the anthology that wrote a poem that way, and that was Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. The poem was on women, entitled A Renunciation. Novelist John Galsworthy called Loney's Shakespeare Identified the greatest detective story of all time. Scholar Warren Hope puts it this way: Loney's work renders a world figure a non-entity and transforms a forgotten courtier into a leading light of humanity's intellectual life. But the literary establishment continues to ignore this book, dismissing it as Looney Tunes. Knowing nothing about this Earl, Loney put together a list of 18 characteristics the great author would possess, whoever he might be. One is that he would be a member of the higher aristocracy with feudal connections. A king, an emperor, prince, duke, is one of the main characters in 34 of his 37 plays. Another is that he loved Italy. Shakespeare sets 13 of his plays in Italy. And it's interesting that de Vere toured Italy, spoke Italian, and lived for a time in Venice. The Stratford William never left England. Over the next 30 years, Oxfordian researchers published 91 books on Edward de Vere, including the first biography. Other notable ones include 3 by Percy Allen and 2 by Eva Turner Clarke. In 1952, Dorothy and Carlton Ogburn published their 1,300-page This Star is England, William Shakespeare, Man of the Renaissance. It has been called the first Bible of Oxfordianism. When I began studying this subject in 1995, The early Oxfordian works were out of print, but Ruth Lloyd Miller, no relation, reprinted Loney's Shakespeare Identified and Clark's Hidden Allusions in Shakespeare's Play in a 4-volume set, and she sent me a mimeographed copy of B.M. Ward's biography of Oxford. In 1984, Carlton Ogburn Jr. published his influential book, The Mysterious William Shakespeare, The Myth and the Reality. While working on it, he notes, quote, "In 1974 came the break I had been hoping for. A Harvard alumnus, he submitted an article on the subject to Harvard Magazine titled, 'The Man Who Was Shakespeare Was Not, and Who He Was.' The magazine's editor accepted it, writing, 'Our magazine is willing and eager to touch the untouchable.' But not its readers. They were irate. One Harvard professor accused the editor of, quote, irresponsible journalism, of, quote, giving idiocies a Harvard cachet. And he asked if future articles in the magazine would say that the earth is flat and that Queen Victoria is in fact a Peruvian transvestite. But Ogburn's book fueled a signal event in the authorship debate, a Moot-Court trial in 1987 before 3 U.S. Supreme Court justices, Harry Blackmun, William Brennan, and John Paul Stevens, sponsored by American University. Attorneys representing the Stratford William and Edward de Vere were each allowed 1 hour to present their case. Justice Brennan presided and ruled, quote, "The Oxford side has the burden of proving its case and the burden of trying to establish his case by clear and convincing evidence, not simply by a preponderance of the evidence, i.e. more likely than not." Following British practice, each justice in turn stated his position and reaction to the arguments heard. This table is taken from a paper I wrote on medical and legal evidence with a British attorney. And it's interesting to note that in British courts, they do not use the clear and convincing standard of evidence. Only in U.S. courts for settling child custody, involuntary commitment, and some other things. With Charles Ogburn looking on, all 3 justices ruled that the evidence presented in the brief time allotted did not meet the clear and convincing standard. But Justice Stevens made a key point. He said, Oxfordians really have not yet put together a concise, coherent theory they are prepared to defend in all respects. 5 years later, the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, Justice Stevens observed that 3 parts of the case are analogous to Arthur Conan Doyle's Dog That Didn't Bark. In Silver Blaze, where Sherlock Holmes discerns that the guard dog, Silence, indicates that he knew the thief that stole the prized horse. The first silence is that William Shakespeare of Stratford had no library in his spacious home. His detailed will does not include any books, manuscripts, or writing materials, and 18 plays had not yet been published when he died. His daughter Susanna, questioned years later, said that her father kept no books in the house. His son-in-law, Dr. John Hall, Susanna's husband and a physician, kept a diary containing patient records and observations on notable people in Stratford, such as Michael Drayton, a poet, the Countess of Northampton, a patron of writers, and the publisher of a French dictionary. In it, he never once mentions his father-in-law. The third silence is most telling. No one noticed or commented on his death. No eulogies, no crypt in Westminster Abbey for England's greatest poet and playwright. The Wall Street Journal published an article in 2009 titled, Justice Stevens Renders an Opinion on Who Wrote Shakespeare's Plays. It wasn't the Bard of Avon. he says, evidence is beyond a reasonable doubt. Justice Stevens declared that Edward de Vere was Shakespeare. He said, quote, only a nobleman could have produced writings so replete with intimate depictions of courtly life and exotic settings far beyond England. He stated that Oxfordian researchers had now accumulated sufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, the criminal standard of proof, that de Vere was Shakespeare. Since Thomas Loney determined who Shakespeare really was, more than 6,000 articles and 350 books have been published, as documented in this index put together by James Warren, soon to be a 4th edition. These are some of the most notable books. My path to becoming an Oxfordian, as I write in a handout that was submitted, began in 1995 when I came across and read Richard Wayland's book, Shakespeare, Who Was He? The Oxford Challenge to the Bard of Avon. And I highly recommended Malice Aforethought, The Killing of a Unique Genius by Dr. Paul Altracci. Dr. Altracci received his MD degree from Harvard and did his specialty training at Columbia, like me, and was a professor of neurology at Stanford before he retired to work full-time on the Shakespeare question. One of the smoking guns in the case, and another great read, is Richard Rowe's Shakespeare Guide to Italy. In Romeo and Juliet, for example, set in Verona, the two lovers meet in a grove of sycamore trees. Retracing the bard's steps in Italy, Richard Rowe found those same sycamore trees right where Shakespeare had placed them, outside the western wall of Verona. Attorneys representing Edward de Vere in a new Moot-Court trial, armed with Hank Whittemore's 100 Reasons Shakespeare was the Earl of Oxford, published last year, could prove not only in a clear and convincing fashion, but beyond a reasonable doubt, that Edward de Vere was Shakespeare. Shakespeare by Another Name is the best biography of de Vere. The one by Stratfordian Alan Nelson, A Monstrous Adversary, presents an entirely negative view of him, arguing that Oxford was too profligate and vile to be the author of the Shakespeare canon. But it's like saying that Richard Wagner was so clueless with money and equally bad person that he couldn't have written the great operas attributed to him, especially Parsifal. There are two good novels on the subject, one biographical, Most Greatly Lived by Dr. Altracci. The other is Summer Storm, a novel Ideas, which deals with the Shakespeare authorship question and also climate change, where the author, Jim Warren, cites in several places the work of Willie Soon. In Summer Storm, Warren compiled a list of 108 factors relevant to the authorship question. In addition to Loney's 18 characteristics, Diana Price, in her book, Shakespeare's Unauthorized Biography, advances 10 more, beginning with evidence of an education. Raymond Jimenez identifies 10 people who knew Stratford's William Shakespeare, but none of them connected him with the great author. Catherine Chiljan, in her book, Shakespeare Suppressed, identifies 21 plays written too early for the Stratford William to have been the author. Other factors include known links to other writers, important people depleted in the plays, and various psychological factors. Only 2 of the 108 factors support the Stratford William, whereas 95 of the 98 applicable ones support Edward de Vere. This is the last refuge of Stratfordians. They must fit the bard's 38 or 40 plays into a 26-year time frame for the Stratford man to have been the author, from 1590, when he was 26 years old, to 1616, when he died. They cite Sir Edmund Chambers, his, quote, definitive 1930 study, where he concludes that 10 plays were written after de Vere died. They point especially to The Tempest, said to be inspired by the shipwreck of the Sea Venture that occurred in Bermuda in 1609. But Roger Strittmatter and Lynn Kosinski show that The Tempest was written at the latest by 1603, and it's based actually on Richard Eden's 1555 translation of Iberian travel narratives. To maintain in 2017 that William Shakespeare of Stratford is a great author is fake news. But why has it taken 400 years to prove that Edward de Vere was Shakespeare? Steeped in a rigorous classical education and fluent in 6 languages, de Vere was the Leonardo da Vinci of the English Renaissance. And like Leonardo, he was a polymath, an expert in many fields, ranging from law, medicine, and astronomy to horsemanship and falconry. Contemporary authors dedicated some 33 books to him. He was the patron of 2 leading acting companies. When de Vere was 26 years old, in the Queen's presence, court scholar Gabriel Harvey said to him, speaking in Latin, quote, "These eyes flash fire, thy countenance shakes spears, thy splendid fame, great Earl, demand the services of a poet possessing lofty eloquence." When de Vere was born in 1550, there were no theaters in London. Latin was the language of law, medicine, and formal court life. 50 years later, at the turn of the century, 10,000 people a week were attending plays in London. Inventing thousands of new words, Edward de Vere turned English into a literary language, and the first English dictionary was published in 1604. So why do historians of the Elizabethan era ignore him? Winston Churchill does not mention Oxford anywhere in his 4-volume A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Elizabeth I, A Study of Power and Intellect by Paul Johnson, contains only 7 references to Oxford, like the 2 shown here. This compared to 125 references to William Cecil, the power behind the throne, 75 to Francis Walsingham, who ran the CIA at the time. Proving that Oxford is Shakespeare is not enough. Historians must posit a concise, coherent theory on the matter that explains why Elizabethan and Jacobean rulers not only compelled Oxford to write under a pseudonym, but why they used state power to erase him. The theory must address the state's motive for doing so, and of course its opportunity and means for accomplishing it. William Cecil, son of a keeper of clothes for Henry VIII and grandson of an innkeeper, was the de facto ruler of England during the first 40 years of Elizabeth's reign. Dubbed her Old Fox, she variously appointed him High Lord Treasurer, Secretary of State, First Minister, and First Principal Secretary. Elizabeth made Cecil a baron, and he became one of the richest men in England, if not the richest, with 300 estates and properties listed in his will. He had 80 servants in his London residence and one of the largest libraries in Europe with 1,500 books and manuscripts. Carlton Ogburn Jr. described Cecil as shrewd, calculating, worldly, avaricious, and probably humorless. Another researcher writes, Cecil's watchword had always been control. He was like a great spider at the center of the web of state, and no vibration of the threads, however slight, escaped his notice. Cecil employed an army of spies, a forerunner to the surveillance state we endure today. William Cecil was born with a cleft lip and probably a cleft palate, and likely had speech defects. Children with this deformity often exhibit behavioral inhibition, but some, like Cecil, do the opposite and display aggressive behavior. As observers have noted, deformity can be an advantage to a statesman in rendering him industrious and bold, and apt to turn the weaknesses and faults of others into opportunities for retribution. He was also master of the Court of Wards, which handled and controlled the realm's finances and lucrative wardships. His son Robert Cecil had an even more disfiguring condition. He was a hunchback, 5 feet 2 inches tall, same height as Napoleon. Robert Cecil acquired even more power than his father. Elizabeth called him her pygmy. His biographer, P.M. Handover, describes him as crafty, with a ruthlessness in his character. A popular ditty went, "Little Cecil trips up and down, he rules both court and crown." The two Cecils followed a Machiavellian principle of he that gives the means to become powerful ruins himself. They toiled to destroy as many records of Oxford's life and literary genius as they could find. His private papers, personal letters, all documents having anything to do with him and his plays, and the Rebels Office, which was in charge of court entertainment, and the Privy Council, Elizabeth's own advisory council. Edward de Vere didn't help matters when he turned Richard III into a hunchback, describing him in the play as this poisonous bunched-back toad. Connecting Robert Cecil in this manner with the said-to-be evil Richard III was not lost on the play's London audience. There is no reference to Richard having any deformities in a much earlier version of the play, The True Tragedy of Richard III, that de Vere wrote when he was a teenager. Cecil got even. He eradicated Oxford's literary paper trail and airbrushed him out of history. Richard III was buried in a friary church in Leicester in 1485. In 2012, archaeologists located and removed the skeleton, his skeleton, at the site of the long-gone church, now underneath the pavement of a car park. Mitochondrial DNA test confirmed that it was indeed his skeleton when compared with the lineal descendants of his sister Anne, 2 women. And of course, as you know, mitochondrial DNA is just transferred from mother to child. So what Richard III had with this CT scan 3D reconstruction was scoliosis, and properly clothed, he would have looked normal. One touted objection to Oxford being the bard are the obsequious dedications Shakespeare writes to Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton, his alleged patron, in his 2 narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece. They do not sound like anything the leading Earl of the realm, with a 500-year history dating from the Norman conquest, would write to a young nobleman. In Lucrece, he writes, "What I have done is yours. What I have to do is yours. Being part in all I have, devoted yours." Henry Wriothesley was not Shakespeare's patron. He was his son. The Tudor heir theory, also called Prince Tudor, explains why William and Robert Cecil sought to erase Oxford from history. It postulates that Queen Elizabeth was Henry Wriothesley's mother, making him the natural-born heir to the Tudor throne as Henry IX. Elizabeth gave birth to him secretively and placed him as a royal changeling in the Earl of Southampton's household. He became the third Earl of Southampton when the second Earl had an untimely death at age 36. Then Cecil took Henry into his home in London at age 7 and continued to raise him. The Shakespeare sonnets and the portrait of a pregnant Queen Elizabeth provide the principal evidence for this theory, along with allusions in his other plays, like the royal bastard son in King John, the secret changeling love child in A Midsummer's Night Dream, the weeping stag in As You Like It, and the strong arm of the state in Titus Andronicus. With de Vere established as Shakespeare, a concise, coherent theory on the matter must next make sense of the sonnets. Oxfordian researcher Hank Whittemore has done that in The Monument, published in 2005. Peter Rush explains and further develops the monument paradigm in his book, Hidden in Plain Sight, The True History Revealed in Shakespeare's Sonnets. The sonnets are not a sexually charged love triangle, as most scholars think. After analyzing each line of the 154 sonnets, translating them into modern English, and examining their key words, Whittemore discovered that Shakespeare's sonnets is a political statement. Edward de Vere wrote them for future generations, as he states in Sonnet 60, "In hope my verses stand." His son, Henry Wriothesley, is the fair youth in the piece, and the first 126 sonnets are a chronological account of his life. George Orwell wrote that history is written by the winners, but one could say that true history is written by the losers, like Shakespeare, de Vere in the Sonnets, and Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag on the history of Soviet Russia. The first 26 sonnets cover Henry's birth in 1574 up to age 26 and urge him to procreate Tudor heirs. The next 100 sonnets start with the Essex Rebellion, led by Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, with its stated objective to oust Robert Cecil. These sonnets deal with Henry's imprisonment for participating in the rebellion as second in command, his death sentence, and reprieve. Sonnet 107 deals with the death of Queen Elizabeth, the mortal moon, ascension of James I to the throne, and the release of Southampton, all on April 10th, 1603. With James' consent, Robert Cecil not only released Henry from the Tower, but also restored all his titles and estates. This is the second in command of the rebellion. The first one in command, Essex, was beheaded within 2 weeks. But it was contingent on de Vere first agreeing to remain anonymous, both as the father and also as the author of the Shakespeare poems and plays. Sonnet 127 to 152 stop being chronological, and they focus on the Dark Lady. And there's been a lot of discussion in scholarly circles about who the Dark Lady was, but Whittemore shows convincingly that the Dark Lady was Queen Elizabeth. Then there's this portrait of Queen Elizabeth, dubbed by Dr. Altracci, the Virgin Queen's mysterious abdominal swelling. Although recognized as a portrait of Queen Elizabeth for more than 300 years, curators of the Royal Collection at Hampton Court Palace, where the painting now resides, titled it Portrait of an Unknown Woman. Under a photograph of the portrait on the collection's website, one finds this statement, quote, "Long thought to have been a pregnant Queen Elizabeth I, owing to the frame having a placard saying Queen Elizabeth, It is now believed to have been a swapped frame. Oxford commissioned the painting and wrote a sonnet in the cartouche on the bottom right expressing his sadness over the loss of his son to her royally commanded foster parentage. His various owners have approximately erased and painted over 30% of the portrait. But a photograph taken in 1896 shows a capital R for Regina on her upper veil that has been erased. Robert Cecil blocked Henry Wriothesley from ascending to the throne because he could not control him and preserve his own power and wealth nearly as well as he could by arranging to have the more malleable James VI of Scotland become James I of England. Writing home, the Venetian ambassador observed, "His Majesty is devoted to the chase and to his pleasures, and readily leaves all to the council, the lords. Greatest and most eminent of all is Robert Cecil, whose authority is so absolute he may truly be called king." Anglo-American history would have taken a different course if the Tudor line had continued under Tudor Henry IX and his heirs. Instead, Charles I, succeeding his father to the throne, held an even more absolutist view of kingship. He shut down Parliament in 1929 and for the next 11 years ruled without a legislature, shunned common law jurisprudence, and governed through proclamation, like the sacred monarch on the Roman model. As a result, between 1629 and 1640, more than 20,000 Puritans fled England for America, turning what had been small, fledgling settlements into permanent American colonies. Had the Tudor line continued with King Henry IX and his descendants, Charles would have kept his head, and the English Civil War that raged from 1642 to 1651 would most likely have not happened, and colonization of America would have taken a different course. Retired, I now live in Leavenworth, Washington, where I have my library and study this subject. If not now, future generations, I believe, will celebrate 3 pivotal years on Shakespeare. 1623, when the First Folio was published, 1920, when Thomas Loney discovered who the true author is, and 2005, when Hank Whittemore published the monument which showed the true history of the science, made sense of them, and unveiled the true history of state power in Shakespeare. Thank you.
Well, my high school English teacher was thoroughly devoted to the man from Avon and talked about his will in which he willed his second best bed to Anne Hathaway, I guess.
Yes.
But it's nothing about the big estate or anything like that, his success as a businessman.
The will was quite detailed. I think it went 7 pages and it had all odds and ends like the second best bed. But no books, no manuscripts, no writing materials. Confirmed by his daughter, Susanna, when questioned years later, that her father never kept any books in his house.
Dr. Miller, my only exposure to this topic was reading Joe Sobrin's newsletter when he was developing the book that he wrote, and he maintained it was Edward de Vere, but other not being educated like you are, I never pursued anything by anybody else, so this is really just an unbelievable awakening for me.
Well, I'll tell you about Joe Sobrin. I've always enjoyed his articles and columns and had a high regard for him. And he published a book titled Anonymous Shakespeare in 1997. It's very readable and it's very good, but he has a fatal flaw because he misinterpreted the sonnets. And he considered them to be a love triangle, and the relationship between Henry Wriothesley, the fair youth, and Edward de Vere, the poet, was a homosexual one. And if you look at the sonnets that way, you never get anywhere, you don't make any sense of it. And there have been 10 different people that have been women that have been candidates for the Dark Lady. And it's only as a political statement does it become clear that it can only be Queen Elizabeth.
I share your interest and I appreciate your talk. Did Edward de Vere go to live with Queen Elizabeth's castle when he was 12, something like that?
Yes, his father died, the 16th Earl of Oxford died when he was 12 years old. And the rule of the time was that minors of the nobility, if they were still minors when their father died with his title, they had to go become wards of the Queen and of the state and were housed in William Cecil's house. So from age 12 on, de Vere was with Cecil, and Cecil got him to marry his daughter. It turns out also that Henry Wriothesley, when his father died at a young age, at the age of 7, he went to live with Cecil. So Cecil had control of, but one good thing he did was that he had a lot of private tutors, and they were very well educated. He had the largest library, and so on that score, that helped to really.
Well, my question is, did you ever run across, after he moved to Queen Elizabeth's court when he was 12, his maternal uncle was one of his tutors? Did you ever run across that?
Yes.
And he invented the sonnet format of poetry and taught Edward de Vere as a teenager.
Well, the one that developed the sonnets, I think his name was Howard, he didn't teach him, but his uncle Golding, who was the brother of his mother, he was one of his tutors along with Mr. Smith. And Golding translated a lot of the Puritan literature in a very dry manner. And he also was alleged to have translated Ovid's Metamorphoses in a beautiful, elegant, flowing, sexually charged manner. And recent scholarship indicates that it wasn't Golding that translated Ovid's Metamorphoses. It was a 13, 14-year-old Edward de Vere that translated it.
I'd like to know, what did the publisher of Shakespeare's work know about the authorship? Or, I mean, was there any information on that?
Well, the first things that were published under the name Shakespeare were the two poems, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece in 1593 and 94. The first play, all the plays were anonymous until 1598 when Love, Labour's Lost was published under the name Shakespeare. And Richard II and III, which had been published a year before anonymously, then was republished with the name Shakespeare. Now these printers likely knew what the score was, but it was the kind of thing where you may know about it, but don't you dare say anything about it or you get your head chopped off.
How did you get interested? Did you start with Shakespeare and then this was a subset that you got into, or?
Well, I've always been interested in literature, and I collect poetry and literature post-World War II. And so I've been a book collector for years, but I subscribed to the orthodox view until I came across the book by Richard Wayland, who was Shakespeare. And it was published in 1994, and I read it a year later, and then that just opened the door. And so after that, I started really looking into it carefully, getting this work from Ruth Lloyd Miller and reading all these things. I probably have 80 or 90 books now in my library on this. And it all began reading, and I suggest in that one-page handout I have, if you like to look into it, I think the first thing to read, even now, is Wayland's book, Who Was Shakespeare? It's a short book, it's written very well, very even-handed, and it sure has convinced a lot of people that started with that.
When I came to this conference, I did not expect myself to be finding myself in defending the conventional literary view that Shakespeare is Shakespeare, but here I am. I have a friend, Ron Rosenbaum, who wrote a book on Shakespeare. Ron was primarily interested in the genesis of the plays and their magnificent beauty. He just had a few remarks about why he believes that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. And let's see if I can summarize them. One, that at the time when the First Folio came out in 1623, 8 years after he died, no one seemed to doubt that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. And second, there is one literary record in which we have Shakespeare identified as Shakespeare, and that is a court deposition which Shakespeare was deposed because two friends of his got into a law fight, and he wanted to be on the good side of both. And according to Ron, I have not read this myself, so I can't speak from my own judgment, but according to Ron, if you read that deposition, on the first reading, he's clearly on the side of one guy, but if you read it again, he seems to be on the side of the other guy. In other words, this guy, Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, seems to be an absolute master of using the English language to have several levels of meaning, in which case this would support the literary ability of Shakespeare on Avon, because they, of course, had to identify him since he was not the Earl of Oxford, but this business gentleman you're mentioning. And on my own opinion, is using your same arguments of the same form, you could conclusively reject the position that Albert Einstein wrote the papers attributed to Albert Einstein. I remember that one of Albert Einstein's college teachers, Hermann Minkowski, is reported to have said, "How can that idiot have written such brilliant papers in physics?"
Well, those are the threads that the academic establishment hang on to, but the overwhelming weight of evidence favors the aristocrat Edward de Vere. There's no way that the Stratford person would have known 6 languages, would have based much of his writing on Ovid's Metamorphoses. And when you go through Hank Whittemore's 100 Reasons for why de Vere was Shakespeare, I think Supreme Court Justice Stevens was correct, even before more recent research, is that the weight of the evidence proves beyond a reasonable doubt that it was Edward de Vere. The problem that the academic world has, and the people studying this, it's like in other fields, like climate science. If you don't follow the prescribed view, you're out of a job, you're out of a degree, and you go nowhere. And I think we're going to find, as this century goes on, that the idea that this person from this village was the author will be overthrown. But it's like Max Planck said, that science it progresses by funerals. And when Rosenbaum and his crowd are gone, the younger people are going to realize that if you take a dispassionate look at the evidence, that the real Shakespeare is Edward de Vere.
All right, we'll take one more question here. Here you go. You get the last.
If Einstein disagreed with the professor, that's his natural reaction.
There you go.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Miller. And we are going to start again at 2 next door.